Hello, this is Dean Radin, and I'm on Your Superior Self.
Hi, I'm Anita Murjani, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hello, this is Dr. Raymond Moody, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hi, Cultural Creatives. I'm Bruce Lipton, and I'm here to join you with Your Superior Self.
This is Paul Selig, and this is Your Superior Self.
What's up, everybody? I'm Aubrey Marcus, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hi, this is Sarah Fay, and this is Your Superior Self.
Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time. This is like such a treat. Your book, Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses, was a fantastic read. It's an important read. When I picked it up, I didn't know what to expect, right? But I'm so glad that I did get to read it because there's like not just your story, but there's also grammatical history behind the punctuation marks, and it helps me as a writer and as an inspiring writer, and just information about the DSM, being a psychology student. I mean, it has everything. It's hitting on all the points that I'm interested in. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you for writing this book.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. We shouldn't scare your listeners away with talk of punctuation. I mean, one thing I've realized is if you mention punctuation, or that you love it, or that you abide by it, or have some expertise in it, then people are scared to write you emails and texts and the whole thing. So,
well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Right. So, a lot of my friends who are well versed in the APA style format, like I'm scared to death to send them anything because we have like peer reviews and stuff and research for school, and I'm like I have like a manuscript that I'm writing that's just kind of like playing with, and I'm like, I'll send it to you, but I'm nervous because you're so well versed in punctuation and grammar. I'm like, I'm not following any rules. I'm just like I told you earlier, I was like I decorate the paper with Christmas tree commas. Like that's what I do.
And it's so I should explain. So my book has 3 strands, and one is, as Trey said, one is my story of having received 6 different mental health diagnoses starting when I was in 8th grade. And then the second strand is about where those mental health diagnoses come from, what they are, which is they come from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which I didn't even know what that was when I was in the health system. And then the third strand is this punctuation. And so there is a reason for that. When I received my first diagnosis, it was around the time also, my first diagnosis was anorexia, and I was pretty critically ill for about 3 years. And so in 10th grade, I almost failed my 10th grade term paper, and my English teacher, I worshiped him. I mean, he was this super smart guy. We weren't friends. Students and teachers weren't friends back then. But I just idolized him from afar. And he brought me into his office, and there were red marks all over the paper. And he told me all the things I'd done wrong, which he was absolutely right. I was literally starving to death and, basically lightheaded, dizzy. My hair was falling out. I mean, I was not in any shape to be studying or writing a paper on Dostoevsky. That was just not a good idea. But anyway, he got to the end, and he looked at me and he said, "And you use commas like you're decorating a Christmas tree." And he was totally right. I just decorated, like Trey said, and I had no idea. And I was so embarrassed that then I spent the rest of my life, I became a teacher, and I was also an ESL tutor and a writer in residence in the New York City public schools. So I've always taught people to write and to read. And punctuation became like, I am going to be so good at this. I will never be embarrassed again. But it came at the same time that diagnoses entered my life as well. So the two things kind of met and are in my consciousness in the same way.
Sure. I think it's so fascinating. I mean, just I was scared. I mean, I'm still scared of the rules of writing, really. I mean, the red pen is a scary thing. Just because it's like, I don't know, we really aren't really taught the rules of writing and punctuation, like commas, like like after reading your book, I was like, it actually has history behind the punctuation marks. And I was like, oh, really? That's fascinating about the comma and semicolon and parentheses. I'm trying to think what else is in there.
Yeah. And what's amazing, which I didn't know actually until I started writing the book, is that we didn't have any space between words. So when, we were writing in Latin, basically it was just one word followed another and the reader had to figure it out, which is a terrible system. There were no spaces. So punctuation is really a way that we make reading easier and meaning easier to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what diagnoses are too. That's what they're meant to be. They're meant to be ways for us to get help when our mental and emotional lives are crumbling or in chaos or whatever it might be. But punctuation's done a better job than diagnoses have. So,
Well,
or not, depending on.
Right. Well, going back to punctuation real quick, the semicolon, right? Like that's my biggest, that is my arch nemesis. Real quick, give me the history or give me a quick rundown of how I'm supposed to use it.
Okay, first thing, I'm going to free you of the semicolon. You can live a totally happy life, never using a semicolon.
Really?
I'm going to free you of it forever. There's only one instance where you ever need to use it, and that's in a list of items that also have commas. So if I were going to say, I want to travel to 3 places, and then I had a colon and it said New York, comma, New York, I would need a semicolon, and then Chicago, comma, Illinois, and then a semicolon, and Baltimore, comma, Maryland, or whatever it might be. And so that's the only time you need it. But what I say to my students is that a semicolon is a comma and a period. So if you don't know how to use a comma and a period perfectly, you've got no business using a semicolon.
Well, I'll just throw that out of my toolbox.
I used to have my students, I used to have them sign a contract that they would not use a semicolon until they turned 40.
Oh, wow.
And then they could use it.
Well, I have
stopped
one more
doing
year. I have one more year.
So
I'll
you could
not
have a
use it.
semicolon party.
Okay. So I wanted you to read a section out of your book because one, I just think it's that powerful and I've never done that on a show before. So I just thought that I would start with you. So if you have something ready, I would love to hear it.
So this is a very different tone. So this is about almost 3/4 of the way through the book. And as I said, I was diagnosed with 6 different mental disorders. First was anorexia, then anxiety disorder, then major depressive disorder, then obsessive compulsive disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And at this point, I am still believing that I have what was on my medical records ADHD and OCD with anxious and depressive elements. But I've been in crisis for a while. And so this is me. I'm getting my Ph.D. and I'm in Iowa City. And yeah, so I think that's all you need to know, except Dr. B is my 5 of my 6 disorders, and we can talk about this later, but we often think of mental disorders in terms of psychiatrists and therapists, but most people are getting diagnosed by primary care physicians or GPs. GPs write 80% of antidepressant prescriptions and 50% of antipsychotic prescriptions to children. They also have very little to no training in psychiatric diagnosing.
How is that even possible?
It's amazing. And so, but 5 of my 6 came from my primary care physician. And at this point, my doctor at the time is named Dr. B. So that's, I think, all you need to know. On too cold a fall morning to be outside for long, I sat on a bench on the pedestrian mall. The cold made my teeth chatter. The outdoor promenade, where students and residents often crowded, was empty of people. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I hovered near hysterics, then fell into them. The suicidal thoughts came regularly and then often. The usual, I can't do this anymore. This is never going to end. I want to die. They were strongest not at night, but mid-morning and in the afternoon, often at the campus recreation center after I'd spent an hour on a stair machine or treadmill trying to sweat them away. I stopped crying long enough to go to my appointment with my therapist, Angela. I'd been seeing her since the depression diagnosis from Dr. B. People said people with depression needed therapy, so I went. The crying she'd witnessed, the suicidal thoughts she knew nothing about. She was young with smiling eyes and a voice that reminded me of a cooing dove. I sat in the client's chair, she opposite me in her desk chair. After some time, therapists like to let you cry. She asked me to talk about it if I could. Nothing's wrong, I said. That's what I don't understand. I'd passed my dissertation defense. I wasn't sad about my ex-boyfriend anymore. She asked what else might be causing me to feel the way I did. The crying started again. It seemed not to come from myself. Then I seemed not to be myself, watching myself in the chair and Angela across from me. I said I didn't want to be there anymore. Angela clarified, where? Here? In the office? Or I tried to answer, but couldn't. Heaves, sobs, ridiculous. Have you had these thoughts before? She asked. I said I had. Our session ended. She made me promise to call every day to check in until our next appointment. I'm responsible for you. I went to class, I taught, I ran, I wrote, I walked, I ate, I called and checked in. At my next appointment, Angela asked how I was doing. Worse, I said. She stood and in a gentle voice said she'd be right back. Don't go anywhere. I started to cry again. Angela returned. We're lucky she's free. Who? Angela led me down the hall to the office of the psychiatrist in her practice. The psychiatrist's office was painted teal. In her 50s, the psychiatrist had long brown hair and wore a suit jacket, a skirt, and heels. She introduced herself, though I can't remember her name. I sat on the couch. Angela stayed in the room. From the psychiatrist's mouth came questions I tried to answer. I measured my words, modulating my voice so that the words didn't sound alarming. It backfired. I devolved into hysterics more extreme than if I'd let myself cry. When I calmed down and looked up, she surprised me. You don't have ADHD or OCD or anxiety or depression. You're bipolar. An exclamation point shouts, and in shouting demands attention. By nature, it cries out with emotion. It's a marker of excitability. It also creates a sense of urgency. It's an interjection, wait, and an imperative, stop. It can signify danger. The prevailing theory is that it was derived from the Latin word io, meaning an exclamation of joy, like hooray, in the 15th century. Supposedly, though the motivation for this isn't clear, a Roman started writing the I, Romans use all caps, over the O. The O shrank by degrees, eventually giving us a line and a dot. The exclamation point didn't have its own key on the keyboard until 1970. Prior to that, to exclaim a point required effort. You had to type a period, backspace, and then type an apostrophe. It took 40 years for the exclamation point to become the hackneyed feature of texts and emails. A salutation has to be followed by one, hello, exclamation point. Simple statements get 3, even 4. Can't wait till my next appointment, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Women are expected to use it more often than men. It's gendered as a symbol of girlish gushiness, but it still has the potential to startle, disrupt, and frighten, to indicate extreme pain and fear, to alarm. Should I stop there?
That's perfect.
It gives you an idea of how the punctuation works in the book.
That's so fascinating. How that's like very creative how you can weave that. I mean, you're weaving in such an intimate moment in your life with punctuation marks.
It's funny because when I looked for representation, when I was looking for an agent, 2 agents asked me to pull the punctuation. They said, we just can't sell this. This is just never going to work. And I ended up then kind of rethinking, and I sent out to these just 7 heavy hitter, like the biggest agents in the country. And I got one, and she loved the punctuation. And she was like, no, it's perfect. It basically gives you a breather, all this intense narrative, and you're going through something so heavy. And then you get these weird moments of like relief just with this talk of punctuation. So it was just great. I mean, I'm so lucky to have found her.
Sure, absolutely.
She's amazing.
It's crazy, right? Like how like you submit something like that, and then it's your life story, and people are like, nah, punctuation stuff, gotta get that out. So go back to that moment, right? You're writing this, and you're let's say you're writing the manuscript. What are you feeling when you're reliving that moment in your life?
It's a little stranger to read it now, but when I wrote the book, the research took a long time, but the narrative came very quickly. And part of that had to do with the fact that I never told anyone in I mean, in 30 years, I probably told maybe a handful of people outside my family that I had any diagnosis at all. It was very different in the sense that, I mean, social media wasn't around for a large part of that. And we just didn't, it wasn't talked about in the same way that it is now. And so to write about it, I was still kind of in secret. And so once I decided to write about it, it just flooded out. It was like 30 years of holding something in. So to write that scene was difficult. I mean, any of the scenes, I mean, I was suicidal for about 5 or 6 years. And so those were really hard scenes to write. And just because when I was writing it, I wasn't as well as I am now. And so that's also part of it, which was that I was closer to that than I am now. I'm much farther from it. And I really now just like when I read it, I feel so bad for her. You know, I just wish I could like hug her. Mm-hmm. And when I was writing it, I was still very scared it was going to happen again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, what number of diagnosis were you on then?
So that was, I was just about to get my 6th. So after that scene, the psychiatrist, then I'm led to a psychiatric ward and I'm told that I have bipolar disorder confirmed.
Sure.
As she did. Yeah.
When do you become aware of a misdiagnosis, right? Like, is it when you go to a new therapist and they tell you no, that's not it, right? Like, I know you struggle, like as a young teenager, right? I think they diagnosed you with, what was it?
Anorexia.
Yeah. Right? And so you believe that you have it because somebody of authority tells you that. And then you identify with that, a part of your young life, even when your young brain is still developing. And then you go to a new therapist and they tell you, oh, well, this may be the reason, or this may be a new cause, a major depressive disorder, right? So is that when you find out that you've been misdiagnosed, is when you go to a new therapist?
It's such a great question, because one thing that you touch on, my passion right now, or my drive, my mission, especially right now with the mental health crisis among teens and children, which really started in 2016, but certainly was exacerbated by the pandemic. I don't know what it's like. They've been through something no one else has ever experienced, but I do know the dangers of being diagnosed with a mental disorder very young and over-identifying with it, which is what I did. So not only did I receive a diagnosis and then another diagnosis, I had completely become the diagnosis I had been given before. So once I was told I was anorexic, like I was anorexic, not I had anorexia, I was told I was anorexic. Then I became an anorexic. I mean, at the time, actually, I was, 12, 13, and my parents were divorcing and I was going to a new high school, and I was terribly sad and I was terrified and I had a stomach ache and I didn't want to eat. But I wasn't counting calories. I wasn't obsessively weighing myself. I wasn't looking at myself in the mirror and thinking I was fat. So I didn't have the key characteristics of an anorexic. Yet my pediatrician, when we went to him, and my parents were absolutely right to take me. I mean, I was my weight was dangerously low. And that day that they took me to see a doctor, I couldn't hold down food or water. So obviously that was the right thing to do. And my pediatrician just weighed me, looked at me. There was no talk of context. There was no talk of what was going on in my life. It was just anorexia. And then I identified everything in my life according to that diagnosis. All my thoughts, behaviors, and emotions had to do with my anorexia. And then that continued. But when I got my next diagnosis, I was in my 20s and I was living in New York City, which is a wonderful place, or it destroys you. So it like either lights you up or it totally beats you down. And at first it lit me up, and then it started to just like suck the life out of me. And I was extremely on edge. I had no money. I was living in a place with no air conditioning. I was partly in a basement and then in a loft I could barely afford. And it was a disaster. And I was just so edgy all the time. And I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. Now, was it New York City? Or did I have generalized anxiety disorder, right? So, but at that point, I was so used to, when you feel bad, it's because you need a diagnosis. That was already, because I'd gotten it so young, that was my way of thinking. And so to get another diagnosis was just, okay, we're getting to the bottom of it, and then later my cat had passed away, which will make some people laugh, but cat people will understand. But my cat of 16 years had died, and I was terribly sad, and I was mourning her for a long time, almost a year. And I was trying to exercise it out of me by running, and ended up just sort of abusing my body at that point through running. And I went to see a therapist, and she said, you have major depressive disorder. Never asked me about my cat, never asked me about the 6-year relationship I'd been in that had just ended. It was just, you have this diagnosis. So again, I accepted it because I thought, oh, okay, that's what I have. That's what it is. So every time, and then, when I got the ADHD diagnosis, I was in a Ph.D. program, like in a college town. It was hard to find someone who didn't have a ADHD diagnosis. Like that would have been, a real coup. Sure. But so every time I just thought, oh, wait, okay, that's actually what's wrong with me. Got it. Now we've got it. Now we've got the diagnosis. A diagnosis holds the key because that's what happens in physical medicine, or is supposed to. You get a diagnosis that tells the doctor the cause, the treatment, the symptoms, and the prognosis. Well, that's not true for really any mental health diagnosis. We don't have any of those 4 things, but I didn't know any of this at the time.
Well, what triggered the research, right? Like, was it the 6th misdiagnosis or what?
Yeah. And the, when I chose the word misdiagnoses in the title, it's because I found out that the definition of that is really fascinating. It is incorrect, but it's also inadequate or inaccurate. And I thought that was so fascinating. So because I didn't want anyone to think mental illness is very, very real, and something was wrong with me. Something was wrong, no question. And anyone who's been through that kind of mental and emotional suffering knows it's just not, it's just beyond normal, quote unquote, normal sadness or anxiety, or, I experienced, borderline psychosis, suicidality. There's something wrong, and you need help, and we should get help. And I wanted to be sure that people knew that I wasn't saying nothing was wrong with me. It's just that every diagnosis I got was in some way either incorrect, inadequate, or inaccurate. And it was just never, it wasn't fitting quite right. And so when I was living with my mother after the portion of the book I just read, I was living with my mother. I was no longer able to live independently. I lived with her for 5 years. This was in my 40s, and I was suicidal pretty much the whole time. And so at that point, I had kind of broken up with my other psychiatrist. It's in the book. It's kind of a longer story, but my sister, I had no psychiatrist. I had no therapist. I was just out of a partial hospitalization program. I was almost out of meds. My other psychiatrist is sort of the villain of the book, and he wouldn't refill my meds. And my sister just swept in and found a psychiatrist for me. And I should just say my family was amazing through the whole thing. And I really pushed them away. I isolated. I was very much alone for most of my life, but they never gave up on me. And I think I know families have it the hardest. And I say that in my book, and they're also the heroes of anything. And anyone who goes through mental illness knows this. And so I just, my family's definitely the hero of my book. But my sister swept in and she found this psychiatrist. I went to see him. We had the initial 30-minute consultation that you have. And at the end, I waited for him to proclaim, as happens in those consultations, what my diagnosis was, or to say, yes, you are bipolar. That's 100% true. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know what you have. And my whole world shifted. And it was the dead of winter, and I walked out of his office. It was in Chicago, and I walked down Chicago Avenue, and just everything looked crisper and harsher. The world looked different to me, and it was just ice on the sidewalk seemed different. And, I just thought, no one knows what I have. All this time, I've been getting these diagnoses proclaimed to me from GPs, often in hospitals where their offices were, men in white coats with stethoscopes around their necks, and I just thought, something's off here. And so I really decided I'm going to learn everything I can about mental health diagnoses. I'm going to find out what they really are, where they come from, who decides, who gets them, how I got them, what the treatments are. And so I just dove in, but I'd gotten a PhD. I'm a research dork. Like, that's fun for me. And so even though I was really fragile at that point, research became my lifeline, and I just wanted to know everything. So I just wouldn't give up, and I just went deep into it.
Yeah. There's a part in the book where you talk about, it was a rough time in your life, but you're living with your mom, and I think it was like her office, you turned into a room or something like that. And you just strictly did schoolwork. You worked on your thesis, I think. And you went out occasionally and did walking the dog or something like that. I was like, for a minute there, I was like, that sounds lovely. Like, I just wish I could just read books and research and just have my own little office space and just dive into, my own little world. But for you, is there a difference between lonely and solitude?
You hit on something so important, which is I'm now writing the sequel to Pathological, which is how I healed from mental illness. And that's why your episode with Chris, what was it called? Chris, his book is
Chris Beat Cancer.
Chris
that
Beat
episode,
Cancer.
Yeah.
Why that was so moving to me is because we're not allowed to beat mental illness. We're told it's lifelong. We're told it's chronic, and it's absolutely unproven. I mean, some people would argue that some diagnoses, it is chronic, and that may be true, but the majority are not. And I was told that I would always be bipolar, not have, it was me, and I would never recover. And I would most likely wrestle with suicidality for the rest of my life. And that's not true. I've fully healed. So, but what you bring up is so important, which is that Thomas Insel, who was former head of the National Institute for Mental Health, he's just written a wonderful book called Healing: Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health, in which he was really one of the proponents that mental health diagnoses are biological. They are, proven. We can prove that they exist. We can prove that someone has them. And he put $20 billion toward research to prove it. And they found nothing. They can't prove it. And so he's since come out with this book, and I'm a very big admirer of him, because he came out and he basically said, I'm sorry. I should have put money toward treatment and toward recovery. And I didn't. And that's such an amazing thing for a man like that to do, to come out and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Like, we just don't do that.
That's
and someone of his stature.
Yeah.
And he's also just a really wonderful man. I've gotten to know him a bit because I'm just so in awe of him. I joked, I interviewed him for something, and I joked that some people are kind of starstruck by the Kardashians. And for me, it's like Thomas Insel from the NIMH. But so anyway, but in his book, he talks about, and other people have talked at length about this, but he repeats that we need three things to heal from mental illness: people, place, and purpose. It's called the 3 Ps. So people, place, and purpose. And I had my mother's room, a room in my mother's apartment. And that, even though I was at my worst then, I also see it now as kind of the beginning of my healing, because for the first time I had a permanent home. My life before that was I was moving all the time and just wasn't stable. And she gave me that. And I had people, I had my family, and I'm so fortunate for that. And my purpose has always been teaching and writing. So I was still writing, as you said, and I was finishing a novel at that point, which was a disaster, as you can imagine. It never went anywhere. But so this is just to say that was, those 3 things are so important. And it's interesting now, I live next door. I live in an apartment building, and I live next door to a transition home for people with serious mental illness. And like, these are people who have no home, and they're outside smoking often. And I walk by, and I'm not presumptuous enough to like go up to them, but how can we ever expect anyone to heal without a home? Like, that's just absurd. I mean, when you think about it. And so that's just still a very big part of my life. And I'm so grateful for that, and trying to help others get that. But did that answer your question? I'm not sure if it did.
I'm just lost in your answer, just kind of like enjoying the conversation.
The 3 Ps kind of, I just always want to mention that to people, because it's so important. And it was not something I knew before.
No, I just enjoy your perspective, right? A person that has had the experience. I mean, 6 misdiagnoses. I'm a blue collar guy. I always forget to say that, neuroses, diagnoses. Like I always like, when I'm in class, they always say it. I'm like, why don't you just say diagnosis?
Well, it's so funny because I actually have decided, my editor and I, no one can pronounce misdiagnoses. It's like we all stumble over it. And so I told my editor, I'm like, the next book, we're having easy to pronounce words on. Nothing tricky.
I know. But just going back to the DSM, right? Because going back to the blue collar DSM, there is a socioeconomic detachment, or maybe a not knowing of what a DSM is, right? Like I didn't know that. I come from a blue collar background, very rural area, and I therapy was looked upon as a weakness. It was you don't go to therapy. I remember when my parents got divorced and we had to go see a counselor, and the entire time I wasn't taking it seriously because I needed to be a strong 12-year-old, right? Like I needed to be that for my siblings. And so I made a mockery of it. And now looking back at it, I just see it as insecurities of a 12-year-old. But then I thought it was, I'm going to not empower myself, but I'm going to take the power back and act a certain way because I don't want to look weak. Wow. Just even as I talk about that kind of hits a little bit of a string there. So the DSM, right? What is it, and how do therapists use it to diagnose patients?
I just want to say it's really amazing that you have that insight now, looking back on your 12-year-old self. But so the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in short, and it's a book. I didn't know this. I just assumed, okay, depression, clinical depression, major depressive disorder. It was like that's like a cancer diagnosis or a diabetes diagnosis, but it's nothing like that. And I didn't know that. And so all our mental health diagnoses are unprovable in like the external world. And what I mean by that is you can take a blood test and say this person's blood sugar level is this high, they may have diabetes or they have diabetes. And this is how we know. I'm not an expert on diabetes and how that works, but we can prove it, right? This person has diabetes, that person doesn't. The problem with mental health diagnoses that come from the DSM is that depression, we can't prove someone has it. There's no blood test, there's no x-ray, there's no scan that we can give. And then we also don't know what makes this person depressed, but that person not. Like there's no normal and no abnormal measure because we can't measure it. So basically what you have is a book, and it's like this, and inside are basically you've got major depressive disorder, and then underneath it is a list of symptoms. And to qualify for the diagnosis, you need a certain number of those symptoms, and they kind of check it off like a checklist. This is how it's supposed to work. And to give you an idea of how the diagnoses are actually created, so I kind of pictured, I don't know, test tubes or labs or people, scientific studies, and this is how they figured out what depression is. But that's not the case. And what I found in my research is they're just made up, really. They're just invented. And that's kind of a harsh way to say it. They are theorized, and they're based on opinions, mainly by white men from the American Psychiatric Association. That's just predominantly who writes the book. And what they do is sit around a table and come up with diagnoses, meaning thoughts, behaviors, and emotions that seem abnormal, or they have evidence of that are abnormal. So to give you an example from major depressive disorder, you need 5 of 9 symptoms to receive that diagnosis. So you would go in to see a psychiatrist, you would tell the psychiatrist how you're doing, and the psychiatrist would sort of check off, yes, they have 5 of 9 symptoms. Well, Robert Spitzer, who was the architect of the DSM, a pivotal figure in psychiatry, sort of like one of the most iconic figures, he really made psychiatry what it is today and how we think of it. And he pretty much designed the DSM to look the way it does. But he was asked, why do you need 5 of 9 symptoms to get a major depression diagnosis? And he said, it was just arbitrary. It was consensus. We went around the table and 4 seemed like too few and 6 seemed like too many. Like that is the criteria we use today. And
Wow.
so, to be fair, psychiatry is in a terrible position, right? I mean, we have the brain and then we have the mind. Like, what is the mind? We don't even know. I mean, they're trying to do something so difficult. I want to kind of give, my book is not at all anti-psychiatry. I still see a psychiatrist. I love my psychiatrist. He's very transparent with me about the DSM and the flaws in mental health diagnoses. He knows he's in the book. He's okay about being in the book. But because I think psychiatry is in a really difficult place. I am against the public not knowing the flaws in the diagnoses we receive because I identified so strongly with my diagnoses. I didn't know not to do that. Part of it was that I got my first one so young. But when I see, in the mental health crisis among teens and children, that you've got these kids, at 3 years old, getting a diagnosis of anxiety disorder. And they're going to grow up to think that that's like diabetes. And it's not. It's just a tool from a book. It's a name that we use, that a clinician will use to try to get you treatment. That's all it is. And that's what we have to work with right now. And that's okay. It's not like, I think everybody means very well, but that's really all a diagnosis is. Now, to your point, I think that most people, at least in my experience, don't know what the DSM is, regardless of socioeconomic status. But I think you're right that there is from the, my own experience, which is limited, but certainly there are different populations who have access to care. And certainly, socioeconomic groups that do, and certain races that do. And DSM diagnoses or mental health diagnoses are incredibly racist. I taught in the New York City public schools for 7 years, and often in low-income areas or economically disadvantaged areas in the South Bronx and South Brooklyn. And those kids got diagnoses of oppositional defiant disorder, an incredibly stigmatizing diagnosis that has been written about in scientific studies as a precursor to criminality. Like, whoa, you can't get anything more stigmatizing than that. But children of color get that diagnosis. But when I went to a school in Queens with white kids, they had ADHD, right? And they're both behavior disorders. So like, what is going on there? Black men are far more likely to get a schizophrenia diagnosis, whereas, a white man would get something different. So there's also that element, which I think you're speaking to in some ways, which is that I think certain areas and groups have a right to be way more skeptical of psychiatry and wary of it, and even not necessarily take advantage of the resources that are there. I understand that is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it doesn't psychology and science pride itself on the journal articles and the experiments that we do and the research. It's all about, you talk about it, validity and replication of a study, right? Like, reliability. But it's crazy to me how we base all of our scientific data on, validity and replication and reliability. But yet we have a DSM book that, guys are sitting around the table saying, what do you think of 4 or 5 or 6 symptoms? Does this count as a diagnosis, right? Like, that's just insane to me, because we put so much power behind the numbers, right? We put so much meaning behind them, but yet when it comes to this, it's very subjective. It's very, it's like, you talk about it's the opinion of the psychotherapist to check box the symptoms. And once you hit 5, okay, now you have this, right? But they're not taking into account the other factors in your life, what you talked about earlier about the cat dying or a boyfriend breaking up or your struggles with family members or anything like that. We just learned about, what was it? A lot of episodic, right? So some of the moments in your life are episodic where you regress back towards the mean. So whenever someone searches out for therapy, usually it's the worst point for them. And then when they go to the therapist and they start going through therapy sessions, they usually regress back to normal, because that's, obviously regression towards the mean, that theory, everything goes back to baseline.
And what's so fascinating about that is also that there's, you're seeing someone at their worst, And so a psychiatrist or a GP is saying, you have major depressive disorder, not you are going through a depressive episode. Like, that's what I'd like to see. That's the kind of diagnosing that I think would be more beneficial to people, which is that, look, you're going through something right now. And then we could be more open about it. It's not this stigmatizing, you will forever be anxious, you will forever be depressed, you will forever be paranoid or psychotic or whatever it might be. It's right now. And not everyone will, some people won't recover, but some will. But right now we aren't even being given a chance. With the DSM, I mean, one defense that a lot of psychotherapists use, oddly, I don't know why it's them that use it so much, but they say, oh, I never use the DSM, which is more frightening because that means they're not using anything. They're not using even, it's just random. Like, I always think, I understand your defense, so that's not coming off the way you want it to. So
do they
there's
have
that
to use
too.
it? Do they have to use the DSM?
You have to use a code. Often to get reimbursed for insurance purposes, you have to put in a code, and every diagnosis has a code. So when you see it in the book, it's major depressive disorder, the code is underneath, and then you've got the symptom list. And most, any, like my psychiatrist, for instance, who's a super smart man and was trained very well. I mean, I'm privileged to get to have a psychiatrist like that. But like, he was trained to use the DSM, and he knows what's wrong with it. And I don't doubt he's not perfect, but I also think he was smart enough and he's a good enough psychiatrist that he could look at me and say, I don't know. And he's since given me a diagnosis and changed it twice. And I don't know what it is, actually. I didn't want to know. And I could call him right now and leave a message and find out tomorrow morning or whatever it would be. But I know that if I knew what I have or what I'm diagnosed as, I would start to attribute all of my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to it, which is what I did. So if I was sad, it was because of my bipolar or my depression. I couldn't just be sad. I couldn't just we're humans. We have bizarre waves of depression for no reason. I mean, that's part of the human experience. And I wouldn't allow myself really to be a human. I was just this person with a diagnosis, and not knowing what my diagnosis is has forced me to start being a human and I don't mean this for everyone. So I don't want anyone with, I don't think diagnoses are bad. They can be very empowering. Like in the autism community, they're very empowering, and they can be a lifeline for some people and an explanation. And I totally respect that. But for me, I over-identified. And I over-identified with all the negatives. And so I just know that if it took me not having a diagnosis to start to really learn how to process feelings. I didn't even know what emotions were until last year. I'm 50 years old. Like something's wrong with our culture, and I didn't know that.
Well, what does your therapist say about the book? He knows that he's in it, right? But what does he take on your opinion about the DSM?
So he's my psychiatrist. So I don't have a therapist anymore. I have seen therapists in the past, but talk therapy really never worked for me. And partly because my experience with talk therapy, and there are a lot of different types, was I tended to complain and think about the past. And I just didn't want to do that anymore, so I do actually, now I think more future and processing emotions in the present. I mean, I do think about the past, but that's all therapy was for me. But my psychiatrist, he is fine with it. I mean, I don't think he's going to read the book. I don't know. Maybe he did, but I hope not, because I kind of make him, he's this kind of punchy guy. And so I kind of say that he's a punchy guy. I don't know punchy, but he's very charismatic. But anyway,
let's hit on that real quick.
He's got no problem with it.
Well, let's hit on that I just realized that I didn't know the difference between therapy and a psychotherapist and what they do, right? I major in psychology, and I totally didn't know the difference.
I was in the mental health system for 30 years. I didn't know the difference. And actually I was mentioning to you, I started a public awareness campaign called Pathological, the movement. And the reason why I did that is exactly this, but the real goal of the movement is to try to correct a lot of the misinformation that's on the internet. And there is so much. And I lived by that information. I got my information from the internet. I believed there was such a thing as a chemical imbalance. and that, the quote unquote chemical imbalance theory that you are somehow deficient in levels of serotonin, and that's why you have anxiety or depression or whatever it is. It's not true. It was debunked 20 years ago, and I didn't know that until I started researching my book. Also, that diagnoses are really just designations. They're something a clinician uses to get you treatment. That's all they are. I didn't know that. Also, just that GPs really aren't trained to diagnose patients. And then the fourth one that we're trying to, make sure people know is that diagnoses, for the most part, are not chronic, that we can recover and we can heal, even though people are telling us that we can't. But to your point, the other thing I didn't know, and I mentioned this because I was doing some research for the site and the awareness, the campaign, and I didn't realize the difference, between a therapist, counselor, and a psychologist, right? So like, what is the difference there? And then what's interesting is any of the people I've just mentioned can give you a diagnosis. Counselors and therapists either have a bachelor's, so like a college degree, or a master's, but they can just have a bachelor's degree to be a counselor, and then some sort of certification on the state level. So there's like an LCSW and all these different titles. So that means that they've gotten some additional training. But a psychologist actually typically, I think most of the time, has a Ph.D. So they've done 6 years of additional schooling. That's a huge difference there. Mm-hmm. And then a psychiatrist has actually gone to med school. So you have that, and then their whole focus has been really diagnosing and psychotropic, administering psychotropic medications. So that's their area of expertise. And then you have a GP who's like, I don't even know how you could be a GP. Like, what are you trained in? You're expected to know everything? That's absurd. I feel so bad for GPs and pediatricians. And so, but they're given 32 hours of, for the most part, of training in psychiatric diagnoses. And then they're expected to help patients when they only have 15 minutes to be with them. It's a really messed up system right now. And there are things we can do, I think, to help fix it. I don't think it's hopeless at all. Like with GPs, it's not an easy fix. I teach at a university, so I know how bureaucratic it is, but just try to get them better training, right? I mean, we can try to up the training. That's kind of a basic curriculum move that we could do right now. But I think also just making sure people know what the system really is and who they're really seeing and who's qualified and who isn't, and all of that would help too.
Yeah, I'm interested. I don't want to prescribe anything. So I'm an undergrad, right? So I have to apply for grad school, and I want to take a positive psychology. I love positive psychology. Yeah. I want to be a positive psychology coach at first, right? After I get my graduate degree, and then I want to apply eventually to some type of get my PhD in something, right? But I don't want to prescribe anything, right? Like, I'm more concerned about how do we amplify your strengths, right? Instead of focusing on the weaknesses, how do we amplify your strengths and help you flourish? That's I read what was it? Oh my gosh, I'm having a total Seligman. Dr. Seligman at Penn is the father of positive psychology, one of the fathers of positive psychology, and his story about how he came to have this like aha moment where his daughter was like, they're outside gardening, and she like literally just looked up at him and was like, you know what, I've been a brat for most of my life. I'm going to try to focus on not being a brat anymore. And he's like, where did this come from? And well, it wasn't like a brat. He didn't use the word brat. It was like something like that. But he noticed that by focusing on her strengths and like helping her grow them, that she could identify, the weaknesses and help her through her life flourish more instead of focusing on the weaknesses all the time. Right. So, I mean, it's all about growth and development. And to me, I rather do that and be a coach, right? Instead of having these limitations on what I can disclose about myself to patients, right? Like, I want it to be like a two-way type of relationship, even though, you really got to be really careful about, obviously doctor-patient stuff, but I want it to be very intimate, and I want it to be like them helping me as well, if that makes sense.
Mhm. I mean, going back to what you were talking about, I mean, the problem with diagnoses and the way that our conversations around mental health are so centered on them, and our mental health treatments are centered on diagnoses, is that they're only negative. There is no talk of strengths, never, not once in any of my, treatments or inpatient treatments and outpatient treatments and all of that. I mean, there was never that talk. It was about managing my symptoms and focusing on my diagnosis and what's wrong and what's bad. And that's really the problem. I mean, if there was a upside to getting a diagnosis, then I could see it. But right now, there's absolutely no, well, I shouldn't say there's no upside. There is, in that we all need treatment. And I totally believe in that, and think that hopefully anyone listening will get the treatment that they need. I certainly needed it and did get it. But I guess I'm saying identifying with it. We tend to identify only with negatives, and there aren't a lot of positives to identify with.
It's just funny now that I think about it, like going back to that 12-year-old self and how I was so anti, therapy or talk, essentially, right? But now I'm like going after that in my professional life. It's actually pretty funny. Oh man, I appreciate the work that you're doing, bringing awareness to this. Not a lot of people know about this. I didn't know a lot about what what you talked about in your book, the DSM especially, and how it could affect someone's life so dramatically, how we misidentify with our diagnoses. And I think it's important for this information to get out, because people, I mean, you wear a white lab coat and people take your word for law. I mean, there's studies on it. I think it's Milgram. I don't know. My teacher would kill me right now for not remembering that, but, and I'm sure I'll get some comments about that study being incorrect as far as the name, but we go to the doctors and we take, let's go back and listen to that Chris Beat Cancer episode. Same thing. They give us this information and diagnosis, and we take it for what, as law, and we identify with it. And next thing you know, we're dying from these symptoms that we identify with that, let's face it. I mean, it might not have been the case if you had just didn't identify so much or had a strong belief in that. That makes sense.
Well, I certainly, and I have no basis for saying this, everyone, just from my experience, but I do know that I reached the point of suicidality because I had been told I had no hope. I had never was told that I could heal. And if you tell people that, I mean, if we want to reduce the suicide rate, stop telling people they can't heal from depression, because you can. I have. I mean, like, there is, that is possible. And for some reason, we aren't allowing people to take that next step. Right now, what I learned is there are 2 steps to mental health, to restoring mental health. One is get treatment and commit to that treatment, whatever it is. For some people, that will be medication. For someone else, it'll be meditation. I mean, whatever it is, whatever works for you, you get the treatment and you commit to it. But the second step is not living in a diagnosis, but using the diagnosis as a path to healing. So there is a point past diagnosis. Right now, we're like treatment, diagnosis, like brick wall. And I want to see us move past that. And it's just, the diagnosis is like a little speed bump. And then you have your whole life ahead of you. And that's what I want to look toward. And what I was able to do just from that one psychiatrist saying, I don't know what you have, instead of locking me into a diagnosis again.
I love that. How can people find out more about you? How can they find out more about the book and your work?
So you can find me at sarahfay.org. It's Sarah, SARAHFAY.org. The book is Pathological, The True Story of 6 Misdiagnoses, and it's at Amazon, or you can go to IndieBound if you want to support your local independent bookstore, but it's everywhere, Barnes & Noble, wherever you want to buy it. And the movement that I've started, or the public awareness campaign, is called Pathological, the Movement, and that's at pathological.us.
Sarah Fay, thank you so much for taking the time. I truly enjoyed this conversation, and I hope to have you back on again, especially when the second book comes out.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me on.